Hello, my name is Quint and I go by Dice on Smogon. And this is going to be the first video of my series analyzing my Smogon Premier League 14 games. I've been meaning to do this for a while actually, and I've just never gotten around to it as a mixture of, apathy and just general anxieties about recording my thoughts and condensing it in a way that I thought would be apt. Nonetheless, I've finally got myself to do it, so that's cool. I've been asked by a decent amount of people to just go over all of my SPL games. Um, One thing I've been wanting to do especially is I played Black and White OU throughout the entirety of the tournament, and it's seen as a very matchup based tier and very tenuous in that regard, and just kind of luck based and kind of resource based in terms of what you use and what the other person uses, and players are seemingly not given agency according to a lot of people who dislike the tier. So I just kind of wanted to dispel that and also go over my general views on kind of preparing for opponents and also creating teams. I think a lot of my ideas have kind of been propagated and become standard throughout the metagame throughout the years. So I feel like going through my own ideas and kind of archiving my thought processes would be pertinent for a lot of folks. So going into it, my first week actually was against Sensei Axew. So going into this tournament, I knew that Sensei Axew had a really good record in SCL, prior team tournament, where he went 8-2 in PU, and I knew that his manager was XCal, who is an old gen mainer who doesn't really play much, but helps prepare for a plethora of tiers and is relatively competent in Black and White for the most part. But I do know that he leans more towards using more standard builds, and I had actually played Sensei Axew prior in Black and White Cup a few years ago, and I knew that he also leaned bulky sand there, so I was just expecting something along the bulkier line, something with Alakazam or Ranaclus, possibly a more standard rain or sand. And I didn't have much to work off with because he had no match history whatsoever outside of the games that I had played with him years ago. So going into this, much like most weeks, I always focus on creating my own resources. I do not think that you should really put too much stock in responding into your opponent's trends and resources, whereas you can focus on optimizing, honing, and creating novel resources of yourself. One of the mandates that I have for any Pokemon team that I use in a team tournament, especially, is that I like to obfuscate all of my resources from team preview. And what I mean by that is if my opponent can read what my sets are and kind of discern what they are from team preview, no matter how quote unquote conventionally strong the team is, I view it as a bad team because I don't want my resources to be on the open. I do not like having to outplay in the game. I like to be able to have a swift game without a lot of hiccups and difficulties, and I do not want to give myself room to mess up. So by creating a stronger, team before the game, I kind of eliminate all my chances to kind of fuck up in the midst of it. And I wouldn't consider myself the best player. I'm a much better builder in that regard. So going into that, these are kind of my general what I knew about him. So going into the team, I really knew that I wanted to build around a Clefable going into it. So Clefable is actually introduced to me by a fellow user, Ping, and I think it is an incredibly cool tech that actually had not been seen before this tournament. It does provide a lot of niches to a general sand team. So first of all, it matches up against rain and weatherless teams, especially against Tentacruel and Starmie. It can Thunder Wave and Stealth Rock, so they can never spin against it. So against weatherless and rain teams, you already have a huge advantage, assuming that neither has an Excadrill. And secondly, it also has the threat of knockoff, since given the team composition from preview, my opponent could assume that perhaps my Landorus has Stealth Rock, right? So the threat of knockoff kind of prevents something like Excadrill from swapping into it willy-nilly until its sets are its set is revealed in full. Additionally, I guess the biggest proponent of why I really like it on this sort of team composition is Stealth Rock. So if you look into the tier, the main Stealth Rock users in this tier are ground types. So we're looking at stuff like Garchomp, we have Landorus, we have Excadrill, Glysaur, and then we have stuff like Seismitoad and Gastrodon. Not Gastrodon, just Seismitoad. And so those are kind of the main Stealth Rock setters that are all ground types. And then you have other ones, predominantly Ferrothorn would be the most non-ground type Stealth Rocker that you would see, but oftentimes it wants spikes in the first place. Nonetheless, Looking at all the ground types, so one thing that Clefable does is actually enables more offensive ground types on your team. So basically all the ground types in this tier are incredibly strong, but if it's forced to use Stealth Rock, it kind of they lose their efficacy in a lot of ways. So freeing up something like my Landorus later to be talked about, so freeing it up to not use Stealth Rock is hugely important, and it just basically just frees up my ground types to have a lot of potency, which is something that I really appreciated. So outside of just having decent, rain and weatherless matchups and the Stealth Rock, it also has a decent matchup against Latios, Reuniclus, and Alakazam on sand teams. Oh, and another thing to note, since I discussed, sand teams often use one of these ground types for Stealth Rock, the reason that you cannot use Tyranitar for Stealth Rock really is because of these Psychic types, right? So Latios, Reuniclus, and Alakazam, they are something that basically mandates Tyranitar in a lot of bulkier teams. And Tyranitar basically has to run Crunch and Pursuit for a lot of these threats, and it's forced to take a lot of damage in checking them, and they're often used in tandem with each other, so it is already hugely overloaded, and it cannot afford using Stealth Rock on almost any team. The only way I would ever use Stealth Rock Tyranitar is if I had another Stealth Rock user in tandem, for example something like Stealth Rock Choice Scarf Landorus, or something like that, where it's not guaranteed. Tyranitar isn't guaranteed either, but between the two of them, they can kind of consolidate between the matchups. Nonetheless, that is not something that was going to be here anyway. And speaking of those Psychic types, that is something that Clefable matches up well against on sand teams. So against Reuniclus, it can come in and Thunder Wave. Against Alakazam, it has to hit 2 Focus Blasts in order to hit Clefable, so it's a 50-50 on top of having to predict it coming in. So it matches up well against Alakazam. And against Reuniclus, it can actually Thunder Wave it for threats later. And speaking of later threats, the general partner that I wanted to use for my Clefable was Landorus. So I really think that sub Smackdown Landorus is one of the most underrated threats in the tier. It hugely benefits from Clefable support. So Clefable not only can Thunderwave Reuniclus, it can Thunderwave annoying threats like Politoed, Slowbro, and Slowking, all of which can generally check Landorus at least once. So having the Clefable support allows me to get substitutes up more readily. It forces a lot of support. And also does what I would refer to as divide and conquer matchups. So Landorus threatens sand teams so well, while Clefable sits against rain teams so well. Clefable, it's good against Ferrothorn even because of Magic Guard, even though against sand teams you kind of don't want to take the knockoff from the Ferrothorn, but against rain teams it's a bit more easy, I guess, to take it. So against sand teams, Landorus is such a huge threat. Between substitute, you can smack down Skarmory swaps. It also supports the Excadrill later. Hidden Power Ice and Earthquake are basically perfect coverage, hitting Glysaur, hitting other Landorus, and things like that. So Landorus just basically hits every threat on a sand team, which in tandem with Excadrill poses a huge offensive threat. So along with Clefable, Landorus just seemed like one of the best offensive partners. And Excadrill is basically someone that I try to fit on every team here. If you look at my EVs, I kind of have a bulkier spread just because it's my Soul Steel type. So I wanted it to be able to take something like Latios Draco Meteor with, not with ease, but more readily than just using max attack, max speed here. And if Sandforce, keep in mind it is a Life Orb boost, so you do not need as much attack as you usually think you need. And Landorus often forces other Landorus and Glysaur in to at least do some damage with Hidden Power Ice. So that means Excadrill is more free to run a bit more bulk and a bit less attack here. I'm just running an incredibly standard set on my Excadrill just because it doesn't really need anything else. I outspeed Kyurem Black and I have Iron Head for the check. I have Earthquake just for general coverage and it's the other stab. Rapid Spin because I am a bulkier sand team and I want to have the prolonged game option if possible. And Protect because I don't really value having Substitute as much on this team, and I think Substitute is a viable option, don't get me wrong. But I really think that since Substitute also helps a lot against something like Jellicent, for example, but I really value Protect since I don't really need to get the Rapid Spin off that much, and being able to preserve my health as much as possible just helps me against, threats that could pose a threat in the long run, especially Reuniclus. And another thing that Clefable does is actually enables Choice Scarf Tyranitar, since Clefable often is it's kind of a backup and tertiary check with Excadrill to things like Latios, like I've said, or Rhinoculus Alakazam, the psychic type threats. So this allows me to run a cheeky Tyranitar set that matches up well against Rain and offense, which is Choice Scarf. I outspeed Latios, which is really good, and get that threat out of the way. I outspeed things like Thundurus, Tornadus, and so it's just generally a really good set. It's my preferred Tyranitar set in almost any sand team I use, unless I'm forced into Choppleberry. I'm just running a standard set here. There's not much to talk about. I am running Ice Beam as my last move with a bit of special attack because I do value getting the hit on Garchomp, especially since my Landorus is not a bulky set. So having that secondary way to hit Garchomp that isn't a Latias outspeed is pretty important since Latias can get pursuited. So yeah, not much to talk about. Tyranitar, it traps stuff, it sets sand, it gives Excadrill its Life Orb boost, and it is enabled via Clefable to not run Stealth Rock and run a more offensive set. So this leads me, so looking in, this being my 4 Pokemon core just means I need Water Resist. Like, there's nothing else that I can really do at this point. And I needed a bulky water, so I was forced into Latias or Latios, or a Mungus, I guess, but a Mungus just made the team feel too slow in my opinion, and I really just value having at least one Pokemon naturally that can outspeed Terrakion. That's pretty much a mandate on all my teams. In addition, something that I find useful as a general team heuristic on most teams is having 2 ground immunes. That's something that I always value, so having Landorus and Latias kind of fits that heuristic for me. Alternatively, having something like Tangrowth, Breloom, or a really solid and sturdy ground resist is something that you can use instead of using, 2 ground immunes. But generally, having 2 ground immunes also helps against spikes, so nonetheless. So on Latias, so I'm running Choice Specs, which is actually kind of an unconventional set. So against someone like Sensei Axew, who does not have kind of a lot of experience in the tier, I really valued having a lot of gimmicks. So that's one of the best parts of Clefable is you don't really know what set it's going to run, until I posted this video. So similar to seen Latias in team preview, you can't really anticipate its choice specs. There's a lot of different things that could run. Choice Scarf, for example, he could expect me to run some, bulky or rocky helmet set, and it's just generally unexpected. So I did prefer Latias to Latios here, not just for the gimmick factor, but for the fact that I'm pretty soft against rain teams. I'm not Choppleberry on Tyranitar, so I wanted to have definitive insurance against, something like Thundurus. And opposing threats like Keldeo were super threatening too, so having the bulk is pretty preferable in my opinion. I do not think that Latios is inherently better than Latias, and I think that's something that needs to be pushed back against. And I really think that you should just consider, what you value more in your team. On this one, I definitively needed bulk. So the only thing to talk about here is, I have Draco Meteor for damage, Surf is mandatory coverage that hits Excadrill and things like that. It's somewhat droppable, but, giving Excadrill a free swap is never that good in my opinion, especially on a team that has Clefable, which does not match up well against Excadrill. So the one thing here of note is Grass Knot. So I like running Grass Knot on Choice Specs Latias because you 2-hit bulky Tyranitar after Stealth Rock. So it's kind of a surprising gimmick, and you can actually run this on Latios sets as well in order to get that extra damage. But on Latias specifically, it prevents the Pursuit Trap, because that's often one of the biggest downsides of using Latias is you can't push through Tyranitar as easily, and it's more readily Pursuit Trapped. So this lets me hit that. And it also hits, bulky water types, and it's kind of unexpected. So again, I'm leaning toward more using using surprising moves on my team as a measure of surprising my opponent, since it is the best of one here. And Trick is one of my best countermeasures against something like Rhinoculus, who is generally kind of a threat against my team on paper. So having, the Trick specs option is a kind of nice backup insurance against a lot of different things, but especially that. And that leads me into my last Pokemon here, which is just Slowbro. I just needed a bulky water type, and nothing fit the bill better than Slowbro in my opinion. Since I am running, offensive Landorus, like I said, I need something that is very good and very cogent against something like Dragonite, something like Garchomp, and ground types especially at large like Landorus. So Slowbro pretty much fits the bill and is the best Pokemon here. I prefer running Rocky Helmet on my Slowbro just because I like to be cheeky and swap it into U-turns. You can even tank something like Choice Scarf Scizor U-turn. You can tank lots of, Landorus U-turns when it's trying to pivot, so it just can't get that free pivot damage, and you can actually, threaten the U-turns, which is really cool. I'm running Flamethrower here. The other options would be either Thunder Wave or a Psychic type move. If I were to run another move instead of Flamethrower, I would run a Psychic type move, since Conkeldurr as well as Keldeo can be pretty annoying to my team. But I just opted for Flamethrower just because I do not like my general Ferrothorn matchup. It swaps into Latias with relative ease. It swaps into Tyranitar with relative ease. I mean, Excadrill can tank hits, but it's not wanting to take Power Whips, and same with Landorus. And Clefable can 1v1, but against bulkier sand teams, you are not trying to take, the knockoff as readily, since they often come with Psychic types or something like that Clefable's trying to check. So just having Flamethrower to ward off spikes was something that I wanted here, but there are other viable options. But yeah, this is my general team going into week 1. I felt like it was a really strong composition. It's a good example of kind of deviating from the standard sand norm while also having some good techs. Clefable having, its cool typing in order to check things, and it also checks Whisperotom, which is something I failed to mention earlier. So overall, I felt like this was a really strong team, and I felt really competent going into my week 1 game, which is here. So there is a little bit of context here. I will swap sides so I'm on this side. There's a little bit of context behind the usernames, but I was really indignant towards us eliminating an alt rule, and I felt like it was a poor decision. And I don't like when people play an alt, since a lot of people kind of use ones that are hard to discern and the players are confused who it is. So I, along with my opponent, actually, we both decided that we would just spam like letters for our alts, which actually proved to be cause for concern in a few turns, you'll see. But I asked him if he would do this just to make a point week 1, since they overturned having the alt rule decision. But yeah, I won't go too much into that. But so looking into this actually was not the best matchup for me week 1. So he has an Excadrill, which matches up really well against Clefable, although Slowbro is really good against a lot of his team. So that's kind of what I was thinking going into it. I was like, Slowbro's really good. Latias isn't that great, but Landorus and Slowbro are kind of my win cons here, and I really want to get the pursuit on Latios as early as possible. And I can kind of feign things with Clefable since he doesn't know my set. So this is kind of all I thought going into team preview. I thought it was about a 40-60 matchup in my head going into it, maybe even 35-65 in terms of determining odds here. So I just led Slowbro just because it matched up well against every Pokemon on his team except Latios. And I really was scared of the Keldeo here. So I just wanted to lead Slowbro just because if he led a ground type, if he led Ferrothorn, even Tyranitar, I was not worried about pretty much anything. And it is a cardinal sin to lead Latios against a sand team, so Slowbro matched well up against anything. And unsurprisingly, he just leads his Keldeo. I can fish for a Scald Burn here. It's pretty free, and I'm not really too worried about anything that he can do here. He does go to Latios, which is smart, and eventually just goes to Ferrothorn on the double, which again is smart. It catches not only my Tyranitar, but it also catches Clefable. So going into this, I was like, shit. I can't handle, Ferrothorn well 1v1. I kind of considered going Slowbro here, but I eventually just went Clefable. I just wanted to get, Thunder Wave on this immediately for my own Landorus. And he goes for a Thunder Wave of himself, so I kind of thought he'd go for another Spike, but I was okay with taking the Thunder Wave trade. And I actually pair there, which is annoying. He gets the knock off of my Clefable, which is annoying. So at this point, this juncture, I could just go for a Seismic and get chip damage on the Ferrothorn. If he knocks again, that would be really scary for my Landorus. But I do know that second Spike is terrible in Pokemon if you don't know. The first Spike does 12.5, and I believe the second Spike does something to the effect of 16.6, while as the third one does 25. So there's only like a 3 to 4% damage differential between the first and second Spike, so it's relatively worthless. Whereas like the second to third Spike is almost a 9% differential. And the first Spike is obviously the most potent. So with that being said, I just really appreciated, how he only had 2 spikes up, and I felt like I could go to Landorus for free, even though it'd be dangerous if he knocked off here. And I felt like I was behind in the matchup anyway, so I really wanted to pose a threat. So I just went to my Landorus. Luckily, he does Paralyze. I don't really know what he did. And he goes to his own Landorus. I could just get a free sub in light of him possibly knock-offing or anything. He just goes to his own, which is good. And this is actually where not having max speed on Landorus came to bite me in the ass. But it's fine. It's fine. I felt like I could still overcome this matchup from this point since I just got a really good positioning here. He just goes for the hidden power. I do the same. He seems to be more offensive spread because my hidden power is not supposed to do 90. That's either a max roll or he does not have much bulk. So that was kind of my thought process going into it. I cannot risk him killing my lander since that is my only win condition, really. So I just double to Slowbro since it's my safest bet here. I think he does. Yeah, he just goes for the hidden power again. So now it's back to Slowbro versus Landorus. He goes back to Latios, which is the best switch. I just slack off because in retrospect, maybe that was too passive of a move and I could have gone for Ice Beam or something. I just really did not want to have him U-turn into Tyranitar and then Pursuit Trap me and I die. So I just went for the safe slack off. But given his offensive spread, he could have not had U-turn. So I don't know. Maybe this feels like a really passive play in retrospect nonetheless. I just go to Clefable on Latios. This shows that he is not choice Specs and he's probably choice Scarf. And I knew that Excadrill was coming in on this, so I just double back to Landorus. Again, I'm just trying to keep the throttle on. Excadrill is going to spin against Clefable anyway, so its health is relatively useless, and I kind of just want to use it as a mechanism for tanking a hit and then doubling back. So he goes back into his Landorus, which is a very smart play. I just substitute up, not expecting what. If he went to Keldeo and I HP Ice, that'd be awkward. I don't lose that much HP. I only lose 12% in the course of this anyway. So I just go for the kill, and I trade 1 for 1. So at this point, he goes his Keldeo. I just go Latias since it's my best cover. Oftentimes on sand, these can run HP Grass, for example. Luckily, he does not burn his Scald. And again, so this is where it gets a little wonky. So he Scald, I live. I think I'm in a good position at this state, but he disconnects. And actually, he did not register his alt since we both agreed to use alts, right? He didn't register it, and when he disconnected, someone logged on and just forfeited for him. This person was later banned, but it was just some random player that wasn't even pertinent to the tournament. But he got really screwed here, and I felt really bad. I was really wanting to play out the rest of this game, and I felt like I was in a decent position, and especially with my Landorus versus his Keldeo were kind of the main threats. And it would have been interesting to see how that played out. I was probably going to Grass Knot on this turn since I think it's more likely that he goes a Tyranitar than Ferrothorn. Because if he goes Ferrothorn, I'd just kind of get a Landorus swap. So, again, not really sure how this would have played out. I felt like my position at this point was decent. But, yeah, I made an aggressive double and kind of made some progress with Landorus. But nonetheless, that was kind of my week 1, game and matchup. I was kind of disheartened to see, I ended up getting the win from that. So I was disheartened to see that's how it played out since I thought I put a lot of care and tactfulness into prepping my team. But I thought it gave me a good amount of momentum from the shoot. I felt really strong about my kind of team ideas going into this tier. So I'm also excited to share with you the rest of my weeks. But yeah, thanks for listening to this video and listening to my thoughts. And I will be posting the rest of my weeks with time to come. And thanks for listening.